You see the headlines, you see the breaking banners screaming across the screen, and you think you already know the story. Another Hollywood legend, another tragic end, another neat little paragraph that wraps a lifetime into a few polished sentences. But what happened today outside Lily Tomlin's home in Los Angeles doesn't fit inside a clean headline because Lily didn't step out like a celebrity doing damage control. She stepped out like a woman who hadn't slept, like someone who had been carrying a secret so heavy it bent her spine and finally decided she'd rather be hated for speaking than haunted for staying quiet. And the moment she opened her mouth, everything shifted. This wasn't the usual grief statement. This wasn't, we lost a great friend and he will be remembered. Lily's voice didn't sound like tribute. It sounded like warning, like confession, like someone finally refusing to protect a story that was never safe to protect in the first place. She didn't use the soft words people use when they're trying to make tragedy feel gentle. She didn't say past. She didn't say gone. She didn't say unfortunate. She used a harsher word, a word that cuts. She said betrayal. And then she pointed directly to the most uncomfortable place possible, not to Hollywood, not to strangers, not to the public pressure. She pointed inward toward family, toward the dynamic between Rob Reiner and his son, Nick. Most people scrolling through this will assume it's the same old script. A famous man dies, colleagues mourn, cameras show up, and everyone pretends the end was peaceful. But Lily didn't play that game. She looked like a witness who finally realized that silence is not neutral. Silence is a choice, and sometimes silence becomes part of the crime. Reporters described her face as shaken, and it's not hard to imagine why. Lily Tomlin is known for being sharp, fearless, brutally honest when she needs to be. For decades, she's been the kind of person who doesn't flinch. But today, she wasn't the comedy icon the world expects. Today, she looked like someone who had been holding her breath for years and finally had to exhale before she drowned. She said she received a phone call 3 weeks ago, a call from Michelle. And when Lily described that moment, you could hear something in her voice that wasn't just sadness. It was the sound of someone replaying a conversation again and again, wishing they had understood sooner what it really meant. Because in Lily's telling, the system didn't just fail this family, it failed them quietly, the way powerful families are often failed quietly, behind gates and publicists and polite smiles, while the rest of Hollywood rushed out perfectly polished statements praising Rob's legacy, mentioning the films that defined a generation, the warm-hearted classics people grew up on. Lily spoke about things that never belong in a tribute. She talked about fear. She talked about bruises. She talked about the kind of tension that doesn't belong in a mansion, but can still live there, thriving behind expensive walls. And then she said something that stopped people cold. She said Rob told her he didn't feel safe in his own home. Think about that for a second. Rob Reiner, a man the world sees as outspoken, confident, larger than life. A man who built stories where justice matters, where truth wins, where the good guys fight back with words and conviction. A man whose public image has always felt sturdy. And yet, Lily described a version of him that the public never met. A version that moved carefully, measured his words, tried to keep the peace not in a political room or a studio meeting, but at his own dinner table. To understand why Lily is speaking now is such an earthquake, you have to understand what she represents in his life. This wasn't some distant acquaintance popping up for attention. Lily and Rob go back decades. They weren't just colleagues who nodded at award shows. They shared history, shared circles, shared values, shared a long stretch of time where you stop being casual friends and start becoming witnesses to each other's private worlds. And witnesses carry things. Sometimes they carry them because they're loyal. Sometimes they carry them because they're afraid. Sometimes they carry them because they keep telling themselves, it's complicated, it will get better, it's not my place. But today, Lily made it her place. She mentioned a film that, on the surface, looked like a beautiful father and son collaboration. She brought up Being Charlie. If you know Rob's career, you know the project was personal. It wasn't just another film on his resume. It was written by Nick, directed by Rob, and publicly framed as something almost therapeutic. A father supporting his son through art. A family turning a struggle into meaning. The press loved that narrative. People wanted it to be true because it's comforting. It's the kind of a story we crave. But Lily said the reality behind that set didn't feel comforting. She said the tension wasn't creative, it wasn't artistic friction. She implied it was dangerous. In her account, Rob once confided that he hoped the film would become an outlet, a release valve, a way for Nick to pour out rage and pain into something controlled, something meaningful. But instead, Lily suggested it did the opposite. Instead of draining the rage, it seemed to validate it. And that changes the entire emotional meaning of what people thought they were watching. Because if Lily's account is true, then what looked like a redemption story was actually a warning sign that the public mistook for healing. She described a Rob Reiner who tried to manage the atmosphere the way good people do when they're scared of what conflict might trigger. A man trying to laugh things off, a man trying to redirect, a man trying to de-escalate, not because he was weak, but because he was still clinging to hope. Hope is a powerful thing. Hope makes parents do impossible things. Hope makes them forgive what shouldn't be forgiven yet, because they're still looking for the child they remember, the toddler they held, the teenager they protected, the version they swear is still in there somewhere. But Lily's tone today didn't sound like hope. It sounded like she was describing the slow death of hope. And then she shared a detail she said had never leaked before. A dinner party at the Reiner estate about 6 months ago. Lily said she was there, and the way she described it wasn't the vibe of a glamorous gathering with witty stories and Hollywood laughter. She described it like the air itself felt heavy, like everyone was measuring their breathing, like the room wasn't relaxed but tense in a way that made your stomach tighten. She didn't describe Nick's behavior as simply erratic or chaotic or out of control. She described it as calculatingly cruel. That is a very different accusation because erratic suggests confusion. Out of control suggests impulse. Calculating suggests intention. And Lily said the most heartbreaking part wasn't even what was said or done in that moment. It was watching Rob shrink, watching a man the world sees as a giant become smaller in his own house, trying to smooth over sharp edges, trying to keep the night from exploding, trying to act like he could absorb the blows the way a sitcom character might. But Lily made it clear this wasn't television. This was real life. And the threat in her telling wasn't outside the house. It was sitting right there at the table. That's where Lily's story begins to feel like more than grief, because she wasn't just describing sadness. She was describing a pattern, a timeline, an escalation, and she was implying that what happened at the end wasn't just a sudden snap, not a single moment that came out of nowhere. She was suggesting something slower, darker, a long burn, a resentment building behind closed doors while the world stayed entertained by red carpets and legacy montages. And if that's what Lily is truly saying, then the question becomes terrifyingly simple. How long was Rob living in fear while everyone else believed he was fine? After Lily Tomlin said the word betrayal, the room didn't just get quiet, it got alert. Because betrayal isn't grief language. Betrayal is motive language. And Lily knew exactly what she was doing when she walked straight into the most uncomfortable detail of all. Money, not Hollywood money in the abstract, not business deals, not a studio power. She was talking about the money inside the house, the money that can keep a broken situation floating for years until the moment someone finally decides to stop paying for the illusion. Lily hinted that Rob had recently made a decision that terrified him, but he believed he had no choice. She said he had been preparing to cut off what she called the financial lifeline, the enabling, the constant rescue missions that kept Nick from ever hitting the bottom he needed to face. And Lily described it like this was the turning point, the line in the sand Rob never wanted to draw, but finally had to. She told reporters Rob had said to her, "I have to stop helping him to save him." That sentence landed like a funeral bell because anyone who's ever watched a family implode knows the cruel truth. The moment the parents finally say no, the moment the support is withdrawn, the moment the safety cushion disappears, that can become the most dangerous moment of their lives. Lily didn't say it like a theory. She said it like a warning that arrived too late. Then she did something that made this feel less like emotion and more like testimony. She admitted she knew things were bad, not in a vague way, in a specific, sickening way. She said the police had been called to the residence in the past for disturbances. Disturbances. That word is so polite it almost sounds harmless, like noise complaints or misunderstandings. But the way Lily said it made it clear she believed those calls mattered. She believed they were signs. She believed they were part of a pattern that was swept under the rug, not just by family, but by the machinery that protects celebrity families from consequences. High-priced publicists, influence, NDAs, the glossy coat of respectability that can hide volatility behind gated driveways. Lily called it the dark side of celebrity that people rarely talk about. Not the glamour, not the fame, the ability to bury domestic chaos so deep that the public never even knows it exists. And then she said something that sounded like regret. She said she urged Rob to get security. She urged him to change the locks. She practically begged him to stop treating danger like a temporary mood. But the response she described from Rob is the kind of response that breaks your heart because it's so human. It's the kind of thing only a parent would say while still trying to believe in their child. "How can I lock out my own son?" Lily quoted him saying. "He's sick, Lily. He's not evil. He's sick." When Lily repeated that sentence, you could hear the pain inside it, because that's the mantra that keeps family stuck in the cycle. It's the sentence that convinces good people to ignore their instincts. It's the sentence that turns a threat into a phase and a predator into a problem to fix. Lily didn't mock Rob for believing it. She honored him for it. But she also made it painfully clear that his greatest virtue, his empathy, his enormous capacity to love, may have been the very thing that left him vulnerable, because he could not view his son as a threat. He could only view him as a tragedy. And then Lily pulled Michelle into the center of the story. She said Michelle Singer Reiner was exhausted, not tired, exhausted. She repeated the word like it was the truest summary of years of chaos, rehab, relapse, forgiveness, explosion, calm. Then the cycle begins again. And Lily said Michelle's fear looked different than Rob's. Rob still had hope. Michelle, Lily suggested, had intuition. She mentioned a conversation that chilled everyone listening, a conversation where Michelle confessed she was hiding knives. Just sit with that image. A home in Brentwood, a mansion, awards on shelves, people praising the family in public, and inside that kitchen, someone is hiding knives because they don't know what version of their son might walk through the door at 2 a.m. That isn't a rich person problem. That's survival. That's a horror story behind the red carpet smile. Lily's voice didn't shake because she was trying to entertain. It shook because she knew what it meant to say these things out loud. She had nothing to gain from it, no career boost, no money, no relevance. She was risking alienation from an industry that prefers uncomfortable truths stay sealed forever. But Lily made it clear she didn't care anymore, because in her words and in her posture, she wasn't just speaking to the public. She was speaking to the district attorney. She was begging investigators to look beyond a single night and examine the history. When she said, "I saw the bruises," she wasn't offering vibes. She was offering herself as a witness. And that's where everything turned from tragic to legally explosive, because Lily's statement directly collides with the defense narrative already forming around Nick. She referenced the posture of his defense team, led by Alan Jackson, and the direction they're signaling: mental health, break from reality, diminished capacity, a strategy to frame this as a medical tragedy rather than a criminal one. Lily didn't need to say the legal terms. She didn't need to be a lawyer. She only needed to outline a history of aggression, financial disputes, and fear, because that paints motive. A person cut off financially, angry, resentful, escalating. And Lily's implication is simple. This wasn't a confused accident. This wasn't a sudden storm with no warning. This was a long burn. And in a courtroom, that distinction is everything. It becomes the difference between a secure hospital setting and life in state prison without parole. It becomes the difference between sympathy and accountability. Lily also highlighted how silent the rest of the industry has been. Tributes poured in, the standard memorial language, The Princess Bride, Stand By Me, A Few Good Men, the legacy, the nostalgia. But nobody wanted to touch Nick, because it's taboo. It forces people to face something terrifying, that success, money, therapy, love cannot always cure what's happening inside a family. And if it could happen to Rob Reiner, a man who seemed emotionally intelligent, connected, protected by resources, then it can happen to anyone. That fear is what keeps people quiet. Lily refused to be quiet. Then she introduced another detail that felt like it belonged in a crime novel, but she delivered it like a real concern. The missing journals. She said Rob was a prolific note-taker, that he journaled his thoughts, his fears, his plans for Nick's treatment. And she asked on camera, "Where are those books?" Because Lily said Rob told her he wrote it all down. That question was more than curiosity. It was an accusation aimed at the timeline. She was implying that evidence might have been removed from the house before authorities secured the scene. And if those journals exist, and if they contain what Lily claims Rob confided, then those pages would become the victim's voice after death, a documented escalation, a record of fear, a roadmap of what was coming. From there, Lily shifted to the surviving children, Jake and Romy, and you could hear how careful she became, like she was walking through broken glass. She didn't want to destroy the living while honoring the dead. She described their heartbreak, their impossible position, losing both parents and the person responsible being their brother. And now the family's oldest friend is on television, confirming the darkest secrets they may not even be allowed to address yet because of legal advice. Lily made it feel like she was speaking for them because they couldn't, like she was choosing to take the heat so Jake and Romy wouldn't have to be the ones to publicly condemn their brother. That, too, felt like friendship, not just to Rob, but to the family members who still have to survive what comes next. A reporter asked Lily if she blamed herself, and Lily's answer was the kind of answer that sounds like trauma speaking through someone's throat. She paused and said, "We all think we have more time." Then she admitted she thought it was a phase, that it wouldn't go that far, and she said she blamed herself for believing logic applied here. That's what haunts people later, the way rational minds try to reason with irrational danger. Rob was a rational man. He believed in persuasion. He believed in words, in progress, in empathy. Lily is telling us he thought he could reason with the demons inside his home, and he was wrong. Then Lily addressed the timing of why she spoke today. She suggested that a bail hearing may be coming, a possibility, however slim, that the defense could argue for house arrest or a secure medical facility pending trial, using a status and complexity as leverage. Lily's statement didn't feel accidental. It felt strategic. By going public with a history of violence and fear, she makes it politically and legally harder for anyone to grant leniency. She hardens the narrative. She makes it harder for the story to soften into poor family tragedy instead of criminal accountability. And as she spoke, the public response shifted in real time. Lily described the internet reaction like a wave turning. At first, sadness, then anger at the waste of life, anger at the betrayal, anger that a man who built movies about justice and truth ended in a way that felt like the opposite of everything he believed. Because once Lily started talking, it became clear this wasn't about one bad night or one explosive argument that had spiraled out of control. What she described next sounded like something that had been quietly unfolding for years, hidden in plain sight, protected by a status, money, and the collective refusal to look too closely. Lily said that after that dinner party, Rob changed, not in a dramatic way that outsiders would notice, not in a way that would spark rumors or headlines, but in the subtle ways that only close friends recognize. He stopped answering late-night calls. He shortened conversations that used to stretch for hours. He joked less. And when he did joke, Lily said it felt forced, like someone trying to prove they were still themselves. She recalled one conversation in particular that kept replaying in her mind. Rob had called her late, his voice low, almost careful, as if he didn't want anyone else in the house to hear. He didn't launch into details. He didn't accuse. He didn't dramatize. He just said something simple. "I don't recognize my own home anymore." Lily said she froze when she heard that. Because home is supposed to be the one place where you don't perform, the place where you don't have to be brave or diplomatic or endlessly patient. And yet, Rob sounded like someone constantly negotiating peace in territory that was no longer safe. She said he talked about walking on eggshells, about choosing words the way politicians choose them, weighing every sentence, anticipating reactions, avoiding triggers. Lily described him as someone who had spent a lifetime standing up to powerful studios, political backlash, and public scrutiny, now afraid of saying the wrong thing to his own son. What made this even harder to process, Lily explained, was how invisible it all was to the outside world. Nick's struggles were no secret. Rehab stints, public incidents, whispers about instability. Those things had already been absorbed into the familiar Hollywood narrative of troubled genius or difficult but talented. The kind of story people are oddly comfortable with because it feels familiar, almost romanticized. But Lily said what people didn't understand was how that instability expressed itself privately, not as chaos, as control. She described moments where Nick would dominate conversations, corner people verbally, push emotional buttons with precision. She said it wasn't loud rage that scared her the most. It was the calm moments, the calculated remarks designed to humiliate, to unsettle, to remind everyone in the room who held the emotional power. And Rob, she said, absorbed the brunt of it, not because he deserved it, but because he was the safest target. Lily used a phrase that stunned reporters. She said Rob became the emotional shock absorber of the family, the one who took the hits so others wouldn't, the one who tried to keep things from escalating by quietly sacrificing his own sense of safety. And that's where Lily's tone shifted from sorrow to something closer to anger. She questioned the role of everyone around them, friends who noticed the tension but chose to stay polite, industry figures who praised the father-son collaboration without asking what it cost, family members who normalized behavior that should never have been normalized. She didn't accuse them of malice. She accused them of comfort. Comfort, she said, is what allows harm to continue quietly. According to Lily, Rob resisted calling it abuse for a long time, not because it wasn't happening, but because naming it would mean accepting that love alone wasn't enough to fix it. And for a parent, that realization is devastating. She said, Rob kept believing that if he stayed calm enough, patient enough, supportive enough, the storm would pass, that if he kept his voice steady, his heart open, his door unlocked, his son would eventually come back to himself. But the calls Lily described didn't sound hopeful anymore. They sounded exhausted. She said Rob started talking about feeling trapped by optics. How do you ask for help when the world assumes you're powerful? How do you admit fear when people expect a strength? How do you tell anyone that the person hurting you is also the person you love most? Lily said Rob worried constantly about what would happen if the truth came out, not to his reputation, but to Nick. He was terrified that exposing the situation would destroy his son completely, and so he stayed quiet. He chose protection over safety, and that choice, Lily implied, may have cost him everything. She said the last time she saw Rob in person, something felt off. He hugged her longer than usual. He smiled, but his eyes didn't match. And when she asked him if he was okay, he didn't say yes. He said, I'm managing. Lily paused when she told that part, because managing isn't living, it's surviving. Then came the call from Michelle. Lily said Michelle sounded shaken, like someone who had been holding herself together just long enough to dial the phone. She didn't give details right away. She didn't have to. Lily said she knew in her bones that something irreversible had happened. What Lily refused to do even then was sensationalize Rob's final moments. She didn't describe the scene. She didn't speculate publicly about the mechanics of the end. What she focused on instead was the silence that came before it. The silence of a man who didn't want to destroy his son. The silence of a family trying to hold together something that was already breaking. The silence of an industry that prefers clean narratives over uncomfortable truths. And then Lily said something that reframed everything. She said, "This didn't start at the end. It ended because it was allowed to start." That sentence hung in the air like an accusation, not aimed at one person, but at everyone who benefited from not asking questions. Because if what Lily is describing is true, then Rob's death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a systemic failure. A failure to recognize that abuse doesn't always look like bruises. Sometimes it looks like politeness, like patience, like endless forgiveness that quietly erodes someone from the inside. And Lily made it clear she wasn't done talking, because in her words, if we only mourn him as a legend, we erase the truth of how he lived at the end. After Lily's statement hit the news cycle, the story has stopped being mourning and has started becoming investigation. Because once a close friend uses words like bruises, fear, missing journals, and financial cutoffs, you don't just get sympathy, you get pressure. Pressure on law enforcement, pressure on prosecutors, pressure on anyone who might have preferred this to stay wrapped in private grief. And Lily knew that she wasn't just speaking as a friend. She was speaking like someone trying to freeze the narrative before it gets rewritten by people with money, lawyers, and a motive to soften the edges. Within hours, sources close to the case began leaking the same two themes over and over. One, Nick's team was preparing a mental health-centered defense. Two, the prosecution was being urged not to treat this like a tragedy, but like a pattern. Lily didn't need to spell out what she feared because the blueprint is familiar. The more famous the family, the more the public gets fed a version of events that feels manageable, or something you can digest without getting too angry, something that allows the audience to move on quickly. But Lily wanted the opposite. She wanted the public to feel it. She wanted people to sit in the discomfort because she believed the discomfort was the only thing strong enough to force accountability. She also hinted that the family had been living in two realities at once. The public reality, where Rob was still a beloved icon, still active, still making appearances, still being celebrated, and the private reality, where the house was being shaped around one unpredictable person. Doors monitored, conversations measured, plans made quietly, friends and relatives deciding whether to visit based on how Nick is doing right now. Lily described a subtle isolation, the kind that creeps in when you're dealing with a volatile person in the home. You stop inviting people over because it's unpredictable. You stop going out because you're afraid of what will happen while you're gone. You stop living freely not because someone puts a lock on the door, but because fear becomes the lock. Then she returned to the detail that kept making everyone's stomach tighten: the journals. Lily said Rob was the type of man who processed everything through words. He wrote like he breathed: notes, observations, personal reflections, ideas, plans, and she insisted Rob had been documenting the family's situation in private, not for drama, for survival, for clarity, for proof. And if that's true, those journals are not sentimental artifacts. They're evidence, a timeline, a record of escalating danger, and the possibility that they are missing introduces a chilling question. If someone removed them, who had access and why? Lily didn't accuse directly, but she didn't have to. She only needed to plant the question in the public's mind, and the public did the rest. Because when a case involves family, money, and a high-profile death, the first thing people look for is not just what happened, but what's being hidden. That's when the conversation shifted from grief to motive again. Lily explained that Rob's decision to cut off financial support wasn't sudden. It was a slow process, one he wrestled with, because every dollar had emotional weight. Every check was framed as help. Every payment was framed as love. But Lily claimed Rob had started seeing it differently, as fuel, as permission, as an endless message that said, no matter what you do, we will keep catching you. And she said Rob finally realized the catching was becoming part of the fall. He told her he wanted Nick to get real treatment, not revolving door rescue. And that meant boundaries, real ones that hurt to set. Lily suggested Nick reacted to that shift like a person who felt entitlement being ripped away, not just money, control, the ability to bend the household's orbit around him. And when you combine entitlement with instability, the results can be catastrophic. She brought up another haunting aspect of the situation, the way love can be weaponized. Lily said Rob wasn't just afraid of Nick's anger. He was afraid of Nick's guilt tactics, the emotional manipulation, the way Nick could flip from rage to self-pity to threats. Not always threats of violence outward, Lily implied, but threats of self-destruction. The kind that makes parents panic and give in because they'd rather be abused than risk their child dying. And that's how the cage forms, not with bars, but with fear and guilt. Then Lily talked about the aftermath in a way that made it clear the family was now in a different kind of nightmare. Because this isn't just a legal case, it's a social collapse. Jake and Romy, she said, were caught between devastation and fury, between love and horror. They didn't just lose their father, they lost their mother too, and the story surrounding their family is now splashed across the screens, debated by strangers, turned into hot takes. Lily's voice hardened when she described that. She said the public doesn't understand what it's like to lose someone and then see their death turned into content. She said the family was being forced to grieve under a microscope, while also dealing with lawyers, police, and the most brutal form of betrayal a family can experience. She also hinted that some people inside the industry were trying to quietly pressure her to stop speaking, not necessarily through threats, through friendly advice. The kind of advice that sounds protective, but is really about containment. Let the family handle it privately. Don't inflame things. You don't want to ruin your legacy. Lily's response to that, in her tone and her posture, was basically this. Rob's legacy is not fragile, but the truth is, and if you don't protect the truth, it disappears. Then she did something unexpectedly tender. She talked about Rob's last good moments, not the tragedy, not the fear, the glimpses of him still being him, a joke he told when he was trying to lift Michelle's spirits, a small moment of warmth that reminded Lily why this loss felt so personal. And in that tenderness, her anger became even more powerful because it wasn't rage for attention. It was rage for a man who didn't deserve to spend his final years managing terror inside his own home. She said Rob never stopped loving Nick, even when he was scared, even when he was exhausted, even when he was quietly planning boundaries. And Lily said something that felt like the cruelest truth of all. Love did not save him. It softened him. It delayed action. It kept him standing in the doorway when he should have stepped away. But Lily made one thing clear. She wasn't telling this story to shame Rob. She was telling it to honor him. Because in her view, honoring him means telling the truth about what he endured, not polishing his end into something comfortable, not letting the story become a neat memorial. She framed it as a warning to every family watching. Sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is someone you would die for. Sometimes the thing that destroys you is not hate. It's love without boundaries. And then Lily ended her statement with a line that felt less like closure and more like a demand. She said, "If this ends with sympathy only, then we failed him twice. First, by not seeing the danger, then by refusing to name it. And in that moment, it became clear what part 4 really was. It was Lily Tomlin refusing to let Rob Reiner become a beautiful story with an ugly ending nobody talks about. She wanted the ugly ending spoken out loud because she believed speaking it out loud was the only chance the living had to get justice. When Lily Tomlin finished speaking, the cameras didn't cut away like they normally do after a celebrity's statement. The reporters didn't shuffle their feet and move on to the next soundbite. Nobody knew what to do with what they just heard because it didn't feel like a memorial. It felt like a fuse being lit. And the next question wasn't, did she mean it? The next question was, why now? Because Lily could have waited for a trial. She could have waited until lawyers laid everything out in a courtroom, until depositions, until sealed documents, until official timelines. That's what people do when they want to stay safe. But Lily did not wait. And in the way she chose her words, in the way she stepped into the spotlight with this kind of weight, she all but answered the question without saying it directly. She spoke today because she believed something was about to happen that could reshape the entire case. Not years from now, soon. She spoke like someone trying to get the truth on the record before it could be softened, redirected, or diluted into something the public could swallow without choking. Because that's the oldest trick in the book when a family has power, money, and complicated narrative. You don't deny, you reframe. You turn it into a medical story instead of a criminal story. You take a situation that feels horrifying and make it sound sad, like it was inevitable, like nobody's really to blame, like it was fate and illness and tragedy all wrapped in one unavoidable knot. And Lily's statement was like a strategic strike against that exact reframing. She didn't use gentle language. She didn't talk in maybes. She didn't stand there and say, "We're still learning details." She spoke with the force of someone who believed that if the public doesn't stay angry, the system gets comfortable. And comfortable systems don't punish powerful families the way they punish everyone else. That's when the mood online shifted. At first, people were just heartbroken. They were sharing clips, posting tributes, revisiting Rob's films, quoting lines, talking about what his work meant to them, remembering the warm feeling his movies left behind. But after Lily's words traveled, sadness didn't disappear. It mutated into anger, because now people weren't just grieving a legend, They were grieving the idea of him, the idea that a man who has spent his career telling stories about truth, courage, and justice could end his life in a situation that looked like the opposite of all of it. It felt wrong, like a violation, like the real world had broken into the safe, cinematic universe he built and shattered it. And Lily seemed to feel that same wrongness in her bones. You could hear it in her tone. She didn't sound like someone enjoying attention. She sounded like someone disgusted by the gap between who Rob was to the world and what he may have been living through privately. Then she said something that made this story even more unbearable to process. She stripped away the celebrity label entirely. She talked about Rob and Michelle not as icons, not as wealthy public figures, not as a famous couple. She talked about them as elderly parents who were afraid, elderly parents dealing with physical imbalance in a situation where emotional volatility can become physical dominance, elderly parents whose resources didn't magically erase fear, elderly parents who could still be harmed, still be isolated, still be trapped by love and obligation. That is not a story people like to face, especially when the names are famous. Because if you accept that it can happen to them, you have to accept it can happen in any household where a parent is aging and a child is unstable, resentful, entitled, or spiraling. It forces people to look at what they've ignored in their own families. It forces people to admit that sometimes love is not enough. Sometimes love, without boundaries, becomes the doorway the danger walks through. And Lily, intentionally or not, opened up a conversation America usually avoids. Elder abuse doesn't always come from strangers or caregivers. Sometimes it comes from the person you raised. And that truth is so ugly, people would rather pretend it doesn't exist. Lily refused to pretend. Then she returned again to the detail that kept hovering over everything like a ghost. The missing journals, not because she was trying to create mystery for drama, but because she seemed genuinely alarmed by what it could mean. If Rob wrote it down, if he documented fear and escalation, then those pages are more than memories. They are his voice, his timeline, his proof. And if those pages are gone, Lily's question becomes unavoidable. Who wanted them gone badly enough to take them before authorities secured the scene? She didn't say a name, but she didn't have to, because once a question like that is asked publicly, the pressure starts to build, and pressure is what forces truth into the open. That's when Lily's words began to feel like the first domino, because in Hollywood, silence is rarely about not knowing, it's often about everyone knowing and deciding it's safer to say nothing. But once a person with Lily Tomlin's credibility speaks, the structure starts to wobble. People who have been quiet suddenly feel permission to talk. People who were afraid of backlash suddenly realize the backlash is already here, and staying silent won't protect them anymore. Crew members, friends, neighbors, people who were around that family during the last few years, people who saw a moment that didn't feel right but told themselves it wasn't their place. Usually it takes one domino. Lily didn't just tap the first domino, she shoved it with both hands. And the biggest reason her statement hit so hard is because she's not some random voice chasing relevance. Lily Tomlin carries a kind of respect in American culture that makes it difficult to dismiss her as gossip. She is seen as sharp, fearless, and real. And when someone like that says, "I saw the bruises," it doesn't land like rumor. It lands like a warning label. Then Lily ended with something that didn't sound like a conclusion. It sounded like a promise. She made it clear the coming days would be chaos, a whirlwind of legal positioning, public statements, strategic leaks, and the inevitable attempt by defense attorneys to paint her as emotional, unreliable, or uninformed. But Lily's posture made one thing clear. She doesn't care if they come for her, because in her mind, the worst thing already happened. Rob is gone. Michelle is gone. And the only thing left that can't be negotiated, can't be spun, can't be bought, is the truth. And that truth, Lily seemed to believe, is heartbreakingly simple. Rob Reiner spent his life telling stories where people stood up to darkness. But at the end, the darkness wasn't in a courtroom or a studio or a political battlefield. It was inside his own home, and he stood between his son and the abyss until the abyss finally swallowed them both. By the time the sun went down that day, it wasn't just Lily Tomlin's voice echoing across the news. It was the sound of a family story cracking open, and once that crack appears, everything people worked so hard to keep hidden starts slipping out, not in one clean reveal, but in fragments. A neighbor remembering a late-night disturbance, a friend admitting that they stopped visiting, someone close to the circle quietly saying, "We all knew something was wrong." Lily called that the most nauseating part. Not that one person spiraled, but that so many people adjusted to the spiral like it was normal, because that's what happens when you're dealing with someone volatile inside a family. At first, it's shocking. Then it's exhausting. Then it becomes routine. Then one day, you realize your new normal is actually a slow-motion emergency you've been living inside. She said Rob lived inside that emergency longer than anyone wants to admit. And what haunted her wasn't only the fear he felt, it was the way he kept trying to make it work anyway. Lily described Rob as someone who couldn't stop being a father, even when being a father became dangerous. She said he kept negotiating with reality the way you negotiate with a child during a tantrum. Soft voice, gentle words, offers, compromises, promises. But the person across from him wasn't a child anymore, and the stakes were not emotional anymore. They were lethal. Then Lily revealed something else that, in her mind, explained why Rob and Michelle stayed in the cycle so long. Shame. Not shame in the public sense, but the private, choking kind that sits in your chest and tells you that if people knew what was happening behind your front door, they would judge you as a failure, that you raised this, that you created this, that the world would reduce your entire life to one unbearable question. What did you do wrong? Lily said Rob carried that question like a secret wound. And when you're carrying a wound like that, you don't seek help the way you should. You minimize, you rationalize, you say it's complicated, you say it's temporary, you say he's getting better, you say he's trying, and every time you say those words, you buy a little more time, but time doesn't always heal. Sometimes time just gives danger more room to grow. Lily explained that in the last year, Rob's voice changed whenever Nick's name came up. It wasn't anger, it was something worse. It was resignation, a quiet acceptance that love had not fixed it, and that maybe nothing could. That kind of acceptance is terrifying because it's the moment you realize the person you've been protecting might not be protectable, that the person you've been saving might not want to be saved, that the person you'd sacrifice everything for might still destroy you anyway. And Lily said Rob reached that realization slowly, not in a dramatic meltdown, in small, heartbreaking increments. he started telling fewer stories about Nick's progress. He started talking more about boundaries, about consequences, about protecting Michelle, about protecting the house, about protecting himself. Lily said those conversations felt like watching a man who had spent decades believing in redemption finally accept that redemption cannot be forced. It has to be chosen. Then came the part Lily didn't want to say out loud, but said anyway. She admitted that she believed Rob was preparing to do something that would have shattered the family illusion completely. Not just cutting off money, but moving toward legal protection, restraining orders, forced distance, structural changes that would publicly signal this is not okay. And Lily said that was the point where everything became most dangerous. Because when you remove someone's access to the things they feel entitled to, when you remove their control over the household, when you stop cushioning their fall, you don't always get gratitude. You can get retaliation. Lily's eyes looked different when she said that word, like she was remembering specific moments she wished she could erase. Moments that made her think, even before the end, that something irreversible was coming. She said she heard Rob use one phrase that chilled her. He said, "I don't know who he is when he's angry." That line isn't fear of a son acting out. That line is fear of a stranger wearing your son's face. And that's what made Lily decide she could not let the story be rewritten as a clean tragedy. Because clean tragedy implies inevitability. Clean tragedy suggests nobody could have stopped it. Lily didn't believe that. She believed people could have intervened earlier. She believed someone should have forced the issue before it became fatal. And she believed the reason it didn't happen wasn't ignorance. It was politeness. It was the culture of don't interfere. It was the instinct to protect a famous name. It was the fear of scandal. It was the idea that private family pain should stay private. Even when private pain becomes public danger, then Lily said something that felt like she was speaking directly to viewers at home. She told people to stop thinking money solves everything, because money can build walls, but it can't build safety if the threat is already inside. Money can pay for therapy, but it can't force someone to tell the truth in that room. Money can hire lawyers, but it can't erase what fear does to a body over time. And money can buy silence, which is sometimes the most dangerous purchase of all, because silence is how a situation keeps breathing. Lily's words carried the sense that she was done participating in that silence. She said she knew people would call her cruel for speaking now, that they'd accuse her of exploiting a tragedy, that they'd say she's stirring rumors. But Lily's response was simple. Cruel is what happens when you let the truth die with the victim. Then she softened again, and it was almost unbearable. She spoke about Rob's tenderness in the last stretch of his life, the way he still wanted to laugh, the way he still wanted to believe in good endings, the way he still tried to protect everyone even when he was the one who needed protection. And she said the greatest tragedy wasn't just how he died, it was how he lived at the end, careful, quiet, managing, like a man slowly shrinking to fit inside a situation he couldn't control. Then Lily ended part 6 with a thought that felt like a knife to the heart. She said, "He spent his life making us stories where people speak up in time." And then she looked into the cameras and added, "We didn't." By the time Lily Tomlin stepped away from the microphones, the story had crossed a line it could never return from. because this was no longer just about how Rob Reiner died, it was about how he lived in the shadows of his own compassion. In the days that followed, everything Lily warned about began to surface. Legal teams moved quickly. Statements were carefully worded. Phrases like complex mental health history and tragic family circumstances started appearing in headlines as if repetition alone could soften what people now understood was far more disturbing. And yet, something had changed. The public didn't accept the soft language so easily anymore, because Lily had already reframed the story in a way that couldn't be undone. She had replaced mystery with pattern, shock with history, tragedy with accountability. She had made it clear that what happened wasn't an isolated moment, but the final collapse of a system that failed quietly for years. As investigators began digging deeper, the questions Lily raised refused to go away. Where were Rob's journals? Who had access to the house before the scene was secured? How many warnings were ignored because it felt more polite to stay silent? How many people sensed danger but convinced themselves it wasn't their place to intervene? And perhaps the most painful question of all, how does a man who spent his life telling stories about courage end up trapped by love? Lily didn't pretend to have all the answers. What she offered instead was something far more powerful: witness. She stood in the place Rob no longer could and told the truth he didn't know how to make public, not because he was weak, but because he was a father, because he believed until the very end that love would eventually win. That belief is what makes this story unbearable. Rob Reiner didn't die because he was careless. He died because he was loyal. He didn't die because he didn't see the danger. He died because he saw it and still chose to stand between it and the people he loved. Lily made it clear she doesn't want Rob remembered only for his films, though those films will outlive all of us. She wants him remembered as a man who tried, a man who gave more chances than most people ever would, a man whose kindness became his vulnerability. And she wants this story to change something. She wants families watching to understand that boundaries are not betrayal, that asking for help is not failure, that love without limits can become lethal, and that a silence, no matter how well-intentioned, can be the most dangerous choice of all. In her final words, Lily didn't sound angry anymore. She sounded resolved. She said Rob believed stories could teach people how to live. So now, this story has a responsibility, not to entertain, not to sensationalize, but to warn. Because if this story is reduced to whispers, if it fades into polite memorials and vague sadness, then the lesson is lost. And Rob Reiner becomes not just a man who died tragically, but a man whose truth was buried with him. Lily refused to let that happen. She spoke so he wouldn't disappear into silence. She spoke so the warning would remain, and now the story belongs to all of us.